So I came here with the intention of reading something I'd already written and read about before, but I'm actually going to I've been inspired by my friend Judy. Where are you, Judy? Asante Dada. So I'm going to go out on a limb and read some stuff that I have never read before in the form of a memoir. So here we go. Here we go. And there will be, for those of you who are Secret Kindness Agents fans, let's see who you are. I know there's some in the room. I will speak about the Secret Kindness Agents some, just to feed that part of what is happening. And I have 15 minutes. Where did Jay go? She just
Yeah, I don't know what time it is. Go with it.
All right, here we go. There is a power in story, and there is a danger in absence. And my life has been described in that way, and it's been defined in that way. My story in America starts in 1997. And if you think back to when that was, it was in a pretty innocent time in the world. We didn't know much about terrorism. We didn't know much about what was happening with Al-Qaeda. We didn't know much about danger in America. I was a senior in high school, and I was trying to figure out what to do with my life. And my best friend had been writing to me. This was before email. And I thought I was going to be a doctor. I knew I wanted to help people. And my friend kept writing letters. Are you sure you want to be a doctor? And my teacher said, if you want to be a doctor, then you really need to see if you're made of the right stuff. And so, being me, I decided I was going to go volunteer at the morgue, and I was going to go work in the children's wing of the state hospital where they had AIDS patients. And at first, everything was fine. And it was fascinating. And I weighed people's brains, and I put my finger in a bullet hole in the back of somebody's skull to trace the trajectory. And I thought, this is amazing. I can do this. And then one day, they brought in a stillborn baby, and I passed out. And I was with the children who had AIDS, who were left there to die alone because in Kenya, we didn't understand what AIDS was yet. People thought it was a demon. And they left their children at the hospital to die alone. And I built relationships with these children, and then they started to die. And a small part of me died as well. And I knew I couldn't be a doctor. And I thought to myself, well, you can't kill people in the eye. I'm gonna be an eye doctor. And so I applied to the University of Brighton in England, and I went for an interview after I gave them my AS level results. And I was leaving the interview, it had gone really well, and I was with my father in the south of England, and it was cold and it was raining, and this Kenyan was not used to that kind of pelty rain, ice stuff that comes from the sky at a 90-degree angle. And as we were leaving this university with my father, some skinheads began to chase us and throw things at us and call me a Paki. And my father turned to me and said, you are not safe here. You need to have a plan B. And I looked at my dad and I said, this was my plan B, sir. He said, all right, plan C. And I wrote to my friend Sonia in the United States. And I said, Sonia, I think you're right. I'm not supposed to be a doctor. I'm not supposed to be an eye doctor. And she said, yes. You're a special kind of stupid because everybody knows you're supposed to be a teacher. You have been a teacher since you were 5 years old. Remember that chalkboard you had in your room that your grandmother dug up from the trash somewhere that you would give us quizzes on? Remember that? You're supposed to be a teacher. So you should come here to Minnesota. The weather is lovely here. I got to Minnesota, and the weather was not lovely in August of 1997. It felt like I was breathing underwater outside, and there were mosquitoes the size of birds. Week 1 of class started, and I walked into my first term seminar, and the professor walked in the door. And he was a man named Professor Cho, and he was from Cameroon, and he had skin the color of mahogany, and I stared at him, and I thought, does he know what he's doing? And my mouth went dry. My face got hot because I had just had a racist thought. Because I realized that even though I am a person of color, I am an African woman who grew up in Africa. I had never had a teacher who was not white. I had never had a teacher who was not from Europe. I had never had a teacher who told me that I couldn't be a teacher. But by not having one, the message was loud and clear. People like you can't do this because people like you don't do this. And as my face warmed up even more, I realized, do I know what I'm doing here? Can I be a teacher? If I don't think he knows what he's doing, and I don't think I know what I'm doing, and I started to panic a little bit because I was homesick, and the giant mosquitoes were outside, and it was weird. And the professor started to hand out the novels that we were going to read for the seminar, and he gave me Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. And I turned the book over, and I saw a photo of the author, and he was a black man. And at this point, my breath got faster, and I started hitching, and I started drawing very short, shallow breaths, and before I knew it, snot and tears were falling in equal measures and pulling on my shirt. And my poor professor came by and said, "My dear, are you okay? Did somebody die?" And I was like, "Yeah, Princess Diana, but that's not why I'm crying." She had just passed the week before. And he took me outside and showed me to a water fountain, something I had never encountered in my life. And as I covered my snot and tears with water from the water fountain on my shirt, I caught my breath and I went back into the room. And Professor Cho asked me to stay with him after class, and I did. He said, "My dear, I think I know why you were crying." I said, "Okay, Professor Cho, tell me, because I'm a little conflicted right now and I need to know what's going on." And he said, "I went through the same thing when I came to America to be a teacher. I had never had a teacher like me. And I know what this feels like, but there's a whole world waiting for you. You go to the library and you find some books." And I dove in, and I almost failed my first semester because I was finding all of these books by and about people like me, because you see, our British teachers didn't want us to know the truth. They didn't want us to know that they had left out our stories on purpose. Because when you leave out stories, you leave out power. And our stories had been left out so that we didn't know and couldn't know that we had power. And we couldn't know that the things that they had done to us were unjust. And as I learned more of these stories and read more of these stories, I felt more and more powerful. Because in life, we all need mirrors that validate our own experiences. We need to see ourselves in history and in literature and in curriculum, because that gives us power. We see folks like us whose stories were worth publishing in a book, whose stories were worth selling in a bookstore, and whose stories were worth reading in a classroom. And also in life, we need windows and doorways into other people's experiences, because part of the reason my face got warm that day in shame and embarrassment was that I realized my white classmates also thought the same thing about me and my family. They had never seen us in positions of authority before. They had not heard our stories, and therefore they didn't know that people like me were worth anything, and I was ashamed. So people need windows and doorways into experiences that teach them that people who are not like them are just as worthy and valid and important. There is a power in story, and there is a danger in absence. I graduated college in 2001, and I got a job over the phone in Minnesota to teach in Nebraska. I didn't have internet, so I didn't know anything about the two schools I interviewed with over the phone. It was Central High School, it was South High School, and the central principal, looking at my resume, said, "So, it says here you speak these 6 languages, so what are you?" And I said, "I'm a teacher." And he said, "You know, Central High School is the most diverse high school we have in the state. You would fit right in here." I said, "Okay." And he didn't say anything about teaching, and he didn't ask me anything about my teaching philosophy or my classroom management strategies or why I wanted to be a teacher in the first place. I hung up the phone feeling a little uneasy. Then I got on the phone with the principal from a South High School, and he said, "Why do you want to be a teacher?" And I kind of explained how my friend called me a special kind of stupid and how I'd always been a teacher, and he kind of chuckled a little bit. I was very nervous. I was sitting there in my pajamas eating Cheerios. And then he asked what my teaching philosophy was. He said, "We have a British literature opening. How do you feel about that?" I said, "Oh, that happens to be my major." He gave me some scenarios. How would you deal with this situation? And I gave him my answers, and then I hung up the phone. And the lady from HR called back and said, "They both want you. You should pick one." And I picked South High, simply because he wanted to know who I was as a teacher. He wasn't banking on a brown face to fill a void in his school. So I got to Omaha in August of 2001, and I got to Omaha South High School, and I quickly realized that I was one of only a couple of teachers of color in the building. And I quickly realized I was the only Muslim in the building, because 2 weeks after I started teaching, 2 weeks after I got to Omaha, Nebraska, 9/11 happened. And I remember standing outside my classroom and seeing panic on the faces of my colleagues and people unable to look me in the eye. And I ran to my department chair's office and I said, "Dr. Kasnick, what's happening?" And she explained what had happened, and I burst into tears and I said, "Please let it not be a Muslim." And she patted me on the back and she brought me a plant the next day, which I promptly killed, being a black thumb. And it was, in fact, people who called themselves Muslims. And an angry student raised his hand later the next day, and he asked me, "Did you know it was going to happen before it happened?" Because there's a danger in absence. I thought about why he would ask me that question, accusing me of being a terrorist. My heart punched my ribs from inside, and I almost couldn't breathe. I let it go because I thought he doesn't know any better. And a year went by, and on the anniversary of 9/11, I asked my students, "Are you having any feelings around this anniversary? Is there anything you would like to talk about?" And a student raised his hand, and he said, "We should turn the Middle East into glass. We should just nuke them all." And I looked at him in the eye because I'd had a year to think about it. And I said, "The people you want to nuke, their faces look like my face. They share my name. They share my father's name. Do you want to turn people like me into glass?" And he thought about it for a minute, and he hung his head, and he said, "It's much easier to kill people who don't have a face. It's much easier to kill people who are anonymous. Thank you for giving me a face to the story." And I realized again that there is a danger in absence and a power in story. And I dedicated my career to filling our curriculum with books by and about people who did not look like my students and who did look like my students. I fought hard. I was teaching Old Goat in a Boat, also known as Old Man in the Sea at the time, to my sophomores. I hated teaching this book. I did a song and dance and pretended like I loved it and tried to make them believe it, and they were just like, "Miss, this ain't good." And so I went and found another book that was on the approved list for sophomores, and it was House on Mango Street. And I thought, this book, this needs to be in front of my 10th graders. It was about a protagonist who was a Chicana who was living in Chicago in the inner city. She was dealing with the same issues that my students at Omaha South High School were dealing with, and I wanted them to have those mirrors. They needed those mirrors because up until then, they were only reading about old dead white men, who, yes, they've done some important things. We might argue about whether those important things were positive or negative, but they did some important things. But I know that they needed this book, and I was told, "Your kids will destroy those books. They're not honors kids. Those are new books." And I had to borrow the books from somebody else, and I brought the books in, and we had the most phenomenal conversations. Because these mirrors validated my students. It gave them confidence. Children who had never read a book in their lives were reading this book. Children were throwing the book across the room in anger. They were feeling emotion. They were having discussions about what had happened to them in their lives. I continued working and managed to get a global literature class started at Omaha South High School, because by then we had so many students who were coming in as refugees and as immigrants. And they were having to explain to their classmates what a refugee camp was. And it was not fair to ask them to do that. So I worked with a white teacher who was having to write a syllabus for her class, her graduate class, and we created this course, and we had books like The Kite Runner and Persepolis and War Child. And it was really interesting to see how this dynamic played out because our department chair would not allow me to teach the course. Ferial might put ideas in their heads, she said. So she gave the class to the white woman, who was very upset and said, "I don't know this stuff, it came from your bookshelf." I said, "It's okay, we'll be fine, I'll give you support." And she did a phenomenal job, but then she left to go to another job, and I was the only person left who could teach the course, and I taught the course. And again, we had phenomenal discussions, and students cried and laughed and hugged each other, and we built community. And then the course was canceled because the department chair said, children need to read proper literature. Because there is a power in story, and there's a danger in absence. And I was giving my students power because they understood that they were important, and they understood that their stories had meaning, and that they were worth more than what their teachers were telling them. My mental health began to suffer because of the homophobia and because of the racism that I was facing from my colleagues, and I made the difficult choice to leave South High School and to go to Ralston High School with the Avenue Scholars Foundation. This was in 2011, and I was one of 2 teachers of color in the entire building. And I was walking down the hallway into an area called the Triangle where all the hallways meet. And a student bumped into me, and he looked down at me and he said, "Damn minorities," and he kept walking. And I looked at my teacher badge, and I looked up, and I couldn't find him because he'd moved on and he was real tall. And I went to my students and I said, "This just happened to me." And they said, "Miss, haven't you noticed in the Triangle where people stand?" I said, "No, I'm usually in a rush and I'm real short, so all I can see is navels, so what's going on?" And they said, "Well, all the black kids stand over here, all the white kids stand over here, the brown kids stand over here, African students stand in the hallway. And whenever there are fights, they happen in the Triangle, and they are usually racially motivated." My heart was broken. This was 2011. I looked at the curriculum, I looked at the teachers, and that danger of absence was all around my students, and they were feeling it. Because I was teaching for a program that taught the most poor kids in the school, and they happened to be almost all the students of color in that school. And they knew what it felt to be picked on. There was a power in story I knew so deeply by that point that I knew I had to give my students a story. And so I knew we had to tell our stories. And as we navigated the issues of bullying and racism and homophobia and transphobia and the power differentials between adults and children, and knowing that hope always comes from the young, I asked my students to write their stories. I asked my students to share their stories with as many people as they could, and I asked their permission to tell their stories. And so we created the Secret Kindness Agents movement. We were going to go around and we were going to do secret acts of kindness anonymously with agent names, so no one would know who we were, because if they knew who we were, they could thank us. And we didn't want thank yous, because then it's not really kindness. And the students gained power, because not only were they telling their stories, they were taking control of their stories, because they realized that you don't need to be rich or powerful or famous or popular to make somebody's day better. Not only that, to make your own day better. And it didn't cure the systemic ills that were happening, but it did make us feel a little bit better. I'm gonna skip forward at this point because y'all can see the TED Talk. But I do want to tell you a little bit about later on the secret kindness agents who got addicted to their kindness moves. And they developed what I came to call their signature moves. So they started to do acts of kindness that were not part of our assignments that we were asked to do, that we asked each other to do. They started to do extra things. There was a student who, her name is Ayeli, Agent ACAT, who was picking up litter outside the school for her first assignment, and she's one of those students who is terrified of people looking at her, just terrified of being noticed. English is her 4th language, she's from Togo, she's very concerned about her accent, and her worst nightmare was that people would notice her. And so she's picking up trash outside the school, and the office secretary comes upstairs and asks me to come downstairs because there's something wrong with one of my children. And so these are my children, my students. And so I go downstairs, and Ayeli's down there, and she's picking up litter outside the school, and she's crying. Not quietly. She's wailing like, "Ah! Ah!" And I was like, "Ayeli, did somebody die?" Channeling Professor Cho. And she goes, "No, they're looking at me. See, they're looking at me." I said, "Yeah, because you're screaming." And she asked me to pick up the trash with with her, and by the end of the semester, this child was so confident in her trash picking up that she was starting to lecture other folks on it. There was a man who was walking down Park Drive and dropped a whole bag of litter, and she walked up to him and she said, "You, I saw what you did. Pick it up, shame on you. I came from Africa to clean up your country. How dare you? Come with me, 20 minutes community service." And this poor man wept and picked up litter with her for 20 minutes. Another student was the only openly gay student in the entire district. This boy had attempted suicide 14 times. He had been bullied by administration, he'd been bullied by teachers, he'd been bullied by students, he'd been bullied by his family, and his mother had died suddenly and she was the only welcoming person in his life. But he decided he was gonna look fabulous every day. He would wear skinny jeans and 6-inch platform heels and My Boyfriend is Fabulous t-shirt and a feather boa. And he was a secret kindness agent, Agent Scrappy-Doo. And he came to me one day and he said, "Listen, this is what I've been doing. I got a job at Joe Tess and I saved up and I bought a lawnmower. And after we close the restaurant, after I'm done washing dishes at night, I put the lawnmower in my father's truck and I'm mowing people's lawns under cover of night in my feather boa and my 6-inch heels." And I said, "Lance, you could die in so many ways. Your boa could get stuck in the motor and strangle you to death. You could fall and get run over by your machine. Also, this is Nebraska. If somebody hears a noise at 3 in the morning in their front yard in the dark with a large machine, they're gonna shoot you." He said, "How about we compromise on a wedge?" I said, "We could do that." "And how about instead of the boa, your Hot Topic fingerless gloves? And maybe do this in the daytime, you know, and ask their permission. And if they say no, you take that gracefully." One more story. Age of Blaze, this poor child, he came up to me one day and he said, "Mama Beast," that's what they called me, "I have a problem, I keep getting slapped." I said, "Okay, who's slapping you, Ernie?" He said, "Well, strangers." "How many times a day?" "Well, about 5-6 times a day, people are slapping me." I said, "Ernie, what are you doing right before they're slapping you?" And he said, "Well, I'm hugging them." And I said, "Why are you hugging the strangers, Ernie?" And he said, "Because they look sad." I said, "Listen, Ernie, sometimes people have what we call resting sad face. So you have to ask them, 'Hey, are you sad?' And if they say yes, then you ask them, 'Would you like a hug?' And if they say no, you maybe offer a fist bump instead." He said, "Can we practice?" And we did. And he came back a week later and he said, "I haven't been slapped in a week. This consent thing is genius." And I said, "Yes, tell all your friends, Ernie." But all my students discovered that they had power within themselves, something that I wish we told young people more often. Because there is a power in story. We all need to learn how to tell our stories. Because out there's somebody just like you waiting to hear it. There's somebody just like you to say, "Because of them, I can." Because you can't be what you can't see. And we need to fill the voids where there is absence. We need to think about which stories are missing in our lives, in our platforms, in our classrooms, in our media. Where are those stories?